And they were singing, Amen, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Please be seated. When I envision in my mind that crowd gathered before the throne, and it says that they were singing, every one of them sounds like Emily Carter when they're singing like we heard today. What a blessing it is. Y'all, I have the best All Saints Sunday story for you today. Get ready for this. You're going to love it. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church in Mississippi, and if you're not from that tradition, you don't know this, but we don't have Saints' Days in the Baptist Church. We don't have special feast days other than Easter Sunday. There's no such thing as All Saints' Day in that tradition. So I knew nothing about these kinds of things. But I did know a lot about the Saints, because when I was growing up in South Mississippi, the New Orleans Saints practiced in Hattiesburg, the town I lived in. Their fall camp was there on the campus of Southern Miss. And coincidentally, a few of the years that they were there, the defensive coordinator for the Saints back then was a friend of my father's. They coached high school football together. I'm actually named after him. And so my dad, through that connection, got myself and my four brothers where we were on the scrimmage field for the Saints as ball boys whenever they scrimmaged in their fall scrimmages. Now, this is in a day of Archie Manning and Danny Abramowitz and some of these other Saints players. So I was standing there right next to them. And I think about what a treat that was. So those were the Saints to me growing up, right? I've loved them ever since 1967 when they began. Now, I had a good friend growing up in Hattiesburg who was the only Episcopalian at that time I had ever met. I didn't even know what it meant to be an Episcopalian. His name was Les, and he was one of the best evangelists I've ever been around, because Les was always trying to get me to come to church with him at Trinity Episcopal there in Hattiesburg. He said, well, we got this great thing going on today, or we got youth group today. Please come and go. And I would go home and tell my mom, and my mom, a converted Roman Catholic, would say, oh, no, you're not going to one of those kind of churches. You know, they're going to stand, they're going to kneel, they're going to do all kind of stuff. We're not going to have any of that from the night boys. So I never did get to go to Episcopal church with Les. And then one day he came up to me at school and said, David, you've got to come to church with me this Sunday. It's All Saints Sunday. All the saints are going to be there. Well, you can't pass that up, right? So I won't ever forget coming home from school and going up to my dear mama and saying, Mama, all the saints are going to be in church in Hattiesburg on Sunday. I've got to go to Trinity Episcopal. They're going to be there. I'm going to get to see them again. And she just kind of chuckled and said, David, you do know that they kind of work on Sundays. They're probably not all going to be in Hattiesburg, Mississippi on an NFL Sunday. So I didn't get to go to All Saints Sunday at Trinity Episcopal. But here I am at an All Saints Sunday here with you at St. Paul's. And I love this day for a lot of reasons, especially for these lessons that we just heard. And this sermon is going to hopefully connect those things together, because it's a sermon about seeing. How do we see, and how are we seen? When I was serving St. Patrick's in Long Beach, Mississippi, as you probably know by now, those of you who have been around here, you know that church was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, as was much of the community that we lived in. And we established a disaster relief center shortly after the storm at what remained of a gymnasium at an Episcopal school down there on the coast. And we decided that one of the best things we could do was begin housing and feeding volunteers who were coming down to help us. We had a lot of volunteers, and it was so wonderful that they would come, but we needed to be able to take care of them so that they could go out and do the work that they had come to do. We would have up to 200 people sleeping in cots in this wounded gymnasium where we had set up shop. We would send them out to work, feed them breakfast and dinner when they came back. And of course, my church, St. Patrick's, that's where we had church on Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights, right there in that gym in their little dining area. Now at Camp Coast Care, we also had a crew of people, some of them that would be plucked out every week from the volunteers who would come down, and some from what became the steady group of people who came to volunteer, and well, they just stayed. They stayed a long time, many of them. And all these people worked really hard to keep the camp running. You can imagine what the background had to take place there. We had to clean and we had to cook, and we were receiving trucks full of supplies all the time, and we had to go out into the community and figure out where the best places for them to go and work. We had a medical clinic that my wife ran, and so we had all this big production going on. It took a lot of people to make this work efficiently. Well, one young man showed up in the very early days, He had really long hair, and he was pretty unkempt, and he was by himself. He was a loner. And it was obvious soon after he got there that he was not just there to help in the disaster work, but also that he needed to be away from wherever he had come from for a little while. We called him Crash, because the first day we gave him the job of driving a four-wheeler with a trailer attached around campus, picking up trash cans and taking them to the dumpster to be emptied. And within the first 10 minutes, he wrecked the four-wheeler, ran it right into the side of the building there. So we called him Crash. And Crash stayed with us for many, many months down there, and eventually everyone just called him that. In fact, I don't even know what his real name was. He was just Crash to all of us. And I had some great conversations with Crash, and I learned a little bit about him and his history. He had quite the story, as you can imagine. He had been in and out of trouble. He's in his late 20s at this time. He has struggled with addiction and bad relationships and worse choices. But there he was. He worked hard, and he showed up, and he was never one bit of trouble for us. In fact, before too long, we all saw him the way the writer of 1 John, that second lesson you heard today, the way that writer speaks about all those who follow Christ when he says, we should be called children of God, for that is what we are. Don't you love that? For that is what we are. As was this long-haired, mysterious, bad driver with a checkered past. A couple months later, when I was preaching in that beaten and battered gymnasium on All Saints Sunday, in that sermon I said what I always say on this day, that the saints of the church that we celebrate on this day are not just those on our calendar. They are all of us. They are all of you. All of you are saints. I proclaim that to that congregation made up of St. Patrick survivors and the volunteers for the week and our Camp Coast Care staff, including Crash. And after the service, he came up to me. He was a bit smelly. He hadn't shaved in months. He had this amazing, crazy beard going on. And Crash engulfed me in a ferocious bear hug. And he whispered in my ear, "Am I really a saint?" To which I replied, "Yes, of course you are." And then Crash leaned his head back and shouted to that broken rooftop where everyone could hear him right there in that holy space, "Hey, everybody, I am a saint." Then he hugged me again. And with tears flowing down his face, he said over and over again in my ear, "No one has ever called me a saint before." You are the saints, so you can never say that yourselves. You are the saints of God. Now this morning, we will baptize 3 precious children into the household of God, and it's a perfect way to remind us of our own sainthood. We say that baptism is a bond between us and God that is insoluble, which means it can never be broken. You cannot do anything to take that bond away. You have it forever, for eternity, really. And these 3 children that we baptize, they will be all in, fully members of the body of Christ. Isn't God good that we can have that? And while this sacrament is a holy and beautiful moment, within it, we'll say together in the baptismal covenant are these wonderful questions of us, and that what they actually are expectations of sainthood and how we are to live in our community, how we are to treat one another, how we are to follow Christ. And when we ask those questions of the parents and godparents, you should be answering them yourselves in your heart with that wonderful answer in our prayer book that I will with God's help. With God's help. Because none of us saints are perfect, and all of us need God's help to live into our sainthood. And so the church gathered today, along with these parents and godparents and family members, will see these children welcomed. We'll hear promises made on their behalf, and we will speak our own vows to be the best saints that we can be, right? Now, I told you this is a sermon about seeing. Let's see ourselves in these lessons. Let's begin with that wonderful scene from Revelation. With John the Revelator, it says, John looked out, and I saw in this vision. He sees a multitude that cannot even be counted. John sees them. And then John is asked, who are they? Well, they are the saints. They are us. They are represented by those names you saw on those posters, but they're also all about us. They are the ones who hunger and thirst no more, whose tears have been wiped away by God. And folks, this is our future. This is the goodness of the Lord when at last we taste and see that goodness in all of its meaning and fulfillment. It is a magnificent scene that we are invited to see along with John the Revelator. And in that second lesson from the letter from 1 John, it joins in that chorus, I think. The author says to anyone who is listening to it, which is you and I this morning, he says, see what love the Father has given us, that we, even us, shall be called children of God, because that is what you are, children of God. See what love the Father has given us. Of course, you heard that wonderful psalm and sang along with it, taste and see that the Lord is good. Choose God, folks. Choose God and taste God's goodness. You will taste at communion the very bread of heaven and the cup of salvation. It is yours, and you do not deserve it. Neither do I. Yet there it is for us, for you, because you are the saints. Thanks be to God. Taste and see. Taste and see the goodness of God. We are not finished seeing yet, because Jesus has to join the story. In that gospel passage, it begins by saying, Jesus saw the crowds. Did you see that part? Jesus saw the crowds. He's gathering them on this hillside. They're coming from who knows where, from miles around, walking to be in his presence. Some of them sick and hurting and afraid, I'm sure, and the poor that were amongst them. And I think when Jesus looks out on them on that hillside, when he looks through his eyes, I think he sees in them those white-robed saints worshiping in heaven that we heard about in the Revelation passage. And Jesus wants them to know, you are beloved children. So he has a message for them. We call it the Beatitudes. But it's Jesus looking at them, it's how he saw them that brings him to this point to say these incredible things to them. He's there with the poor and the fearful and the downtrodden and the sick. He is surrounded by the meek and those who hunger for thirst for righteousness. There they are. Jesus sees them differently than we do, I think differently than we see ourselves. So Jesus says, have a seat on this hillside, and gathers them and says, guess what? You are the blessed. And actually, the Greek word that we usually translate in English to blessed more accurately means happy. Happy. You see the Sermon on the Mount perhaps a little differently if you use that word. Happy are the poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is coming. Happy are the meek. They will inherit the earth. Happy are the peacemakers. Boy, we need more of you. You can do these things or be this kind of person and be blessed and be happy is what Jesus says to them. Jesus saw the crowd and taught them this transformational message. Jesus sees you and is still teaching us, saying to you, come, you saints of God, taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Taste and see. So can you say it with me this morning, just like Crash? I am a saint. You did not say that like you meant it. This is good news, folks. This is incredible news. I am a saint. Well, that's much better. Say it like you mean it. But also say this to yourself. When people look at me, what will they see? What will they see? They will see a child of God, because that is what you are. See that in yourself. See it in others. And then, with God's help, be a saint, because it's our day.